Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest Alan Gannett, and he's here today to talk to us about his new book, The Creative Curve. Now, Alan is the CEO and founder of Track Maven, and he believes that we've been spoon-fed the notion that creativity is providence of genius. Well, most of society is geared to telling us if we're not a genius, we might as well pack up and go home. Alan really believes that that's not true. Creativity isn't a gift that you either have or you don't. And Alan's here today to share with us why and how to get it. So let's welcome to the show, Alan.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, what a pleasure it is to have you here, and what a fabulous book. I loved it, and I learned a lot. I've been doing kind of in that creative world for a while, and then to get your book and read it, I was like, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff here I had no idea.
Yeah, the goal is to overwhelm you with geekiness, so I'm glad I succeeded.
Yeah, and it was right up my alley, totally right up my alley. Well, and so what inspired you to write this book? Because we know you as the creative guru. What kind of inspired you to write this book?
So the book is all about this question of, whether or not we can learn to become more creative. And I run a big data company that helps a lot of big marketing companies figure out, what are the things that are resonating with their audiences and trying to really understand the sort of consumer preferences and trends. And the thing I've always had the sort of belief system around was that, well, creativity is a rational thing. You can learn and get better at it. I'd read some of the research and the science, some of the stories about it. And I realized a few years ago, it was about 4 years ago, that I was in the vast minority. That most people have this image of creativity as this mystical, magical, semi-divine thing that has strict a few of us, but for the rest of us normies, we're sort of helpless. And this, to me, was a really dispiriting notion, and I got kind of frustrated. Hearing people who I knew had all this potential, I knew were very smart, I knew were very capable, have these limits on themselves. And, there's this famous study in the 90s that tested kindergartners for creative potential and found that 86% tested at creative genius levels, but by the time they're high school seniors, it was like 15%. And so you see that something's happening in our culture where we are taking all this creative potential, but for some reason it's not turning into creative achievement. And I don't think it's because of ability. I think it's because of what we tell ourselves about creativity.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that you're one of the few brilliant people that doesn't have a unicorn in your backyard, It's actually something that can be attained for anybody.
You don't have a unicorn in your backyard? I thought we all got those.
Oh, wow, I missed that day. Well, and because you're right, because a lot of times when people think of creativity, they do think of it as this, magical kind of genius thing that only a few select people have. And so, knowing that something that can be developed, I think is encouraging. But also when you look at what the school systems are doing, it's like, maybe we should rethink what we're doing there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the stories are so fascinating because think about Mozart, for example. Mozart is sort of the example that everyone always goes to. They're like, you start talking about the book, they're like, well, what about Mozart? And the thing is that we have this notion of Mozart. A lot of it comes from the movie Amadeus, where in the movie Amadeus, it starts with he's 3 years old, he's blindfolded playing the piano for the Pope, and Salieri is narrating, and he's talking about how, Mozart wrote his first, concerto at 4, opera at 6, all this stuff. And the reality is that, this is not true at all. Mozart, the real story of Mozart was when he was 3 years old, his dad, who was basically a helicopter dad, said, Mozart, I love you, but you should never say to a child, I love you, but you're going to become one of the world's greatest musicians. And little Mozart was like, okay, whatever you say, Dad. And Mozart's dad got him literally the best music teachers in all of Europe and made this little kid practice 3 hours every single day of his childhood. And then Mozart wrote his first truly original piece of music, not when he was 4 or 6, but when he was 17. This is after 14 years of practicing 3 hours a day with the best music teachers in all of Europe under the conditional love of a helicopter dad. This is not the story of someone sort of walking out of the womb playing the piano. And so we have these notions and these mythologies around creativity that are just kind of comical and wrong, but we've internalized them in such a deep way in our culture that they really affected how we think about this stuff. And that's worrisome. I mean, in school, I remember hearing the story about how, Darwin noticed that, the birds on the islands were different depending on the island. He had this eureka moment, and that's where natural selection came from. And no, the real story of Darwin is that he spent years and years and years thinking about natural selection and writing the book on natural selection, and it literally took decades for him to finish it. And so we have these sort of silly, fanciful notions around creativity because I think they have done well in terms of selling magazines and stories about creators, but they're not actually true.
I think it also, I think it also puts a lot of stress on people who are younger, thinking that they have to live up to these myths when when you consider creativity.
Oh, yeah, and it's one of those things where I think parents feel all this stuff where they're like, well, what's little Johnny's special passion? We have to find something that he's great at or divine at. And the reality is that everything in the beginning takes a lot of hard work. There isn't anything that the second you sit down, it's immediately easy. Sometimes it may feel that way, but in reality, what scientists have found when they look at stories around talent development and quote-unquote natural-born talent is usually there's some sort of misattribution error. So maybe you find the 12-year-old girl who the first time she ever goes to a track meet, she's incredibly fast. Everyone's like, wow, it's natural-born talent. But then you actually realize if you look hard enough that ever since she was 5, her dad, who loved baseball, was playing baseball with her in the backyard, and she was sprinting between the bases in the backyard. And so without realizing it, she'd actually been sprinting for 7 years. And so what you find is that we're actually very bad at sort of backtracking and looking at the origin of talent because we don't really think to look at it until we already see it.
Yeah, and notice it. Well, and I kind of want to bring you into the picture, of course, because you started noticing patterns at a young age. And, I'd love for you to kind of share a little bit about that.
Yes, I've always been sort of a data and pattern obsessed guy. I think a lot of it comes from when I was young. My parents got divorced when I was I think 1, maybe 2, and, I was an only child. They both worked full-time plus jobs. My mom at one point got laid off and went back to school. And so I just spent a lot of time by myself. And I found that the result was I was constantly thinking about how to amuse myself. And one of the things I sort of fell into was I started always looking at patterns and trying to figure out how to reverse engineer things, whether that was a video game, which I spent way too much time on as a kid, or, when I was 18, I was a senior in high school, and I had this phase where I was like, okay, it can't be that hard to get cast on a game show. And so I proceeded to apply for literally every game show on the planet. And I got called for an audition for Wheel of Fortune. I never watched the show before, and so what I did was I ended up watching all these Wheel of Fortune episodes and reading all these blog posts about the audition experience and realizing that there's a pattern to the contestants they picked. And this works, by the way, if you ever want to get cast on a game show. It's actually pretty easy. Basically what they're looking for is people who can enunciate, people who are willing to embarrass themselves a little bit and can talk loud. I was like, I can do all 3 of those things. And so I drank a lot of espresso. I went in, I auditioned for Wheel of Fortune. I did an Elmo impression, and they were like, you're on the show. And so I was terrible at the puzzles. They had a puzzle test that I had not studied for, and I did really bad. And unfortunately, that probably came home to roost because when I was on the show, I lost to Joan from Alexandria, Virginia, who won $60,000 and is continually scarred in my brain. And so I've always found that patterns are a really interesting and valuable way to sort of engage with the world.
Well, Joan is obviously famous, more
classic
so than
Joan.
beyond the game. Yeah, classic Joan. But hey, it takes a lot of courage to do that too, though. To espresso up and do an Elmo and and show up for one of these things. But it sounds like you were so fascinated with the patterns that you were just ready to go.
I mean, I've always been someone who thinks that I think my parents, and I think this is why a lot of it does, you think that comes back to nurture. I think my parents always were pretty hands-off, but when they were hands-on, it was very much like, you can do what you want to do, and you decide. And I think that sort of gave me the ability as a kid to sort of go down and chase down my own rabbit holes and realize that a lot of these rabbit holes, if you're willing to think about them in a sort of structured way, were actually sort of gameable, learnable, winnable, whatever the proper term is for that. And I think that's a very exciting thing for us as humans. I think the idea that, there's things out there that we're not good at today, but we could be good at is really promising.
Oh, I think so too, because a lot of times people grow up thinking, gosh, if I'm not good at a specific thing, that I'll never be good at it.
Yeah, and the science just shows us that's not true. I mean, there's this famous sort of business thing that people talk about, which Malcolm Gladwell popularized, which is the 10,000 hours rule, which is this idea that with 10,000 hours of practice, you can become good at anything. And the issue is that he kind of has it right in some sense, but he also has it terribly wrong. So the 10,000 hours rule is based on research by K. Anders Ericsson, who's a very famous professor who studies talent development, has done a lot of the seminal work in the space. And what he talks about in his research, well, there's two big mistakes with the 10,000 hours rule. The first is that the research had that 10,000 hours was the average across skills, because different skills take different amounts of time. I mean, there's not some magical cell that at 10,000 hours your brain goes, aha, you're an expert. What you actually find is that, skills like playing the piano, for example, take on average about 25,000 hours because people have been doing it for so long, right? There's lots more people trying it. On the other hand, there's skills like digit memorization, which is now there's all these competitions around digit memorization. And if you want to be the world's best digit memorizer, it only really takes about 400 hours because less people have been doing it. It's been around a lot less. So that's one issue with it. But the second issue and the bigger issue with it is that Ericsson's research is not at all about practice. See, practice is actually something very specific. Practice is the idea of just doing something over and over again. It's repetition. It's to help make something more rote, to make it sort of, muscle memory, to be able to do it, quote unquote, in your sleep, as we say. No. What his research is about is all about something called deliberate practice. See, deliberate practice is actually very different. Deliberate practice is all about taking a macro skill and bringing it down into a tiny little micro skill. It's the difference between playing basketball and practicing left-handed mid-court dribbling over and over again. Because the point of deliberate practice is actually to keep stuff sort of front of your brain, to stay conscious about it. It's not to fall into automaticity. It's to actually be able to say, okay, what am I doing? What's working? What's not working? How do I iterate on this? It's the difference between if you're a painter practicing by, repainting the Mona Lisa versus, practicing brush pressure where you just practice brush strokes over and over again. And it turns out that, with enough deliberate practice, with enough hard, thoughtful work, we can become good at anything, but it's not just about hard work. And that's a very important distinction.
I'm so glad that you took the time to explain that, because a lot of people are probably feeling pretty relieved to know that, hey, it's something I can learn. There's some differences here in regards to the time and the hours that it would take, but it's not impossible.
No, it's not impossible. And, the big thing you see is that, it's not shocking to us that so many of the world's best young musicians, for example, come from upper middle class backgrounds because they have access to the resources to actually be able to engage in that deliberate practice. It's not that, it just so happens that all these upper middle class kids from suburbia are, hit with these amazing musical talents, is that they have the access to the time, the teachers, the resources to actually be able to engage in that deliberate practice.
Yeah, and really decide if that's something they even enjoy or like to do.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, and so this kind of leads me to my next question, because you talk about divergent thinking in your book as well. And, I'd love for you to explain what that is. I mean, I think a lot of us, when we hear that, we're like, oh, the movie, or the book series. But, I'd love for you to explain what that is and the relationship, how useful that is in the relationship between intelligence and creativity.
Yeah, so divergent thinking is basically creative thinking. It's the sort of academic term for it. It's connecting disparate ideas together in new and novel ways. And what's really interesting is when we study creativity in academic settings, we use divergent thinking tests as the way to measure creativity and creative potential in people. And there's actually some amazing research here. So, we think of creativity as intertwined with genius, this idea that, you have to be one of these geniuses, and the term genius comes up a lot when you talk about creativity. But the reality is that scientists, when they actually look and they actually do things like, compare IQ tests to divergent thinking tests, what they find is actually above a relatively mid-range IQ, about a 104, they actually find there's no correlation between IQ and creative potential. We actually all have the same creative potential. There's a famous study that was done by Louis Terman, who Americanized the IQ test. He was a professor at Stanford, and he brought the IQ test over from France, and he named it the Stanford Binet IQ test. And a big part of the reason why he was fascinated by IQ was that in the early 1900s, there was this perception of genius as this thing that was weird, that was something you should be worried about. And this was sort of a holdover from the late 1800s, where there was all this mad genius literature, both these sort of pop science books, but also books like the Frankenstein book, for example. And so he had this idea that what happens if you could test people for genius, and then we could see if they were normal or not. And so he took a few thousand school-age children, and he tested them for IQ. And he took the ones that had an IQ that was at a genius level, and he started sending them surveys every 5 years. There was about 2,000 of these kids. And he wasn't a particularly great marketer. He named these kids his termites, which is kind of terrifying. And he started sending them these surveys. And they continued even after he died. His protégés kept doing them. So this has turned into the longest longitudinal study ever. And what he found that was so interesting was that having a genius level IQ, well, you were pretty normal. You were normal when it came to your levels of depression, divorce, suicide, all these things. But you were also normal when it came to success. There were mechanics. There were service employees in this group. In fact, there were no household names, no future Nobel Prize laureates. In fact, the only two kids he tested that went on to win Nobel Prizes were two kids who didn't make the cut. And so what you find when you actually look at the research is that IQ, genius, isn't actually related to creativity. Creativity is its own separate skill, and it happens to be one that's learnable and nurturable.
Oh, that's encouraging, especially with what we're hearing in regards, the school systems are great for what they do, but at the same time, if you're looking to encourage people to be more creative, maybe there are some other things that we can consider as far as making changes in how that system runs.
Totally. The school system right now, the big issue is that, you're driving kids to see the world in terms of, well, let me actually back this up for a second. I think the bigger issue is that we still designed our education system around sort of the 1960s, 70s model of careers, when we're literally entering a world where AI is going to automate lots and lots of high skill but repeatable jobs. Lots and lots of high skill but repeatable jobs. And the issue is that many people in the school system are driven to high skill repeatable jobs, whether that's different types of legal jobs, accounting jobs, even many medical professions are high skill but repeatable. And so we tell our kids, don't take risks. Creative professions are a great way to be poor. Become a doctor, become a lawyer, become an accountant. But the world that we're moving to is that the most future-proof set of career skills are creative skills. Those are the things that will be hardest to replicate. And I think we're underestimating how quickly and how severely AI is going to upend the sort of traditional career structures that we think of.
Oh, without a doubt. My goodness, you look at companies are clamoring for people who are creative. There's we want people who think outside the box. And so to be able to foster education in a way that would develop that in a greater capacity, I think should be paramount.
100%. And it's something that is going to take, I think, a lot of activism from parents to really get politicians and legislators focused on it, because right now we do have a system in public education where it's about efficiency, it's about delivering results at scale, and so we drive people to sort of middle of the bell curve type things because those are relatively, in the past, good risk-reward ratios. But going forward, I think we're going to live in a culture where there's a lot more variability, and you're going to have to take higher risks if you want to continue to have, good living standards.
Mm. Well, and so this kind of brings me to my next question for you, because, your book is filled with so much great information. Was there anything when you were doing your research for this that surprised you? Going, gosh, I didn't know this, because, you've got so many phenomenal stories from interviews that you've done for this book.
So there's a whole bunch of things. One of the things that surprised me the most was, I spent a lot of time with a lot of the academics in the space here, and I went into the book writing process sort of, always having this notion that, well, creativity is learnable, you can get better at it, but, I still sort of held on to this idea that, there's probably some people who are much better at it. And I was shocked by the amount of consensus there was among the academics who spend all their time in talent development, the study of greatness, which is an amazing name for a field, the study of greatness. But I was surprised by the consensus these academics had that no, talent is learnable, creativity is learnable. In fact, it is something that everyone should learn. And I was surprised by how clear they were with that and how much in agreement they were. That was particularly surprising. The other thing I thought was surprising was I spend in the book, the back half, I explain these 4 patterns I found that these creatives that I interviewed all did. One of them, which was particularly surprising to me, was that these great creatives are also some of the biggest consumers of creative products. See, we have this notion, I think, that there's these 2 groups of people in the world. There's consumers and there's creators. We talk about the creative class. But one of the things is that these creators all told me these stories about how both as children and ongoing, they spent huge amounts of their time consuming content. I tell the story of Ted Sarandos, the chief content officer of Netflix, who's been there for 18 years. Now they're producing 700 original shows this year. That's not episodes, that's shows. And he told me the story of how, as an 18-year-old, he got a job as a video rental store clerk. And instead of doing his homework, he decided to watch every single movie in the store. I can't tell you how many novelists told me they lived near a library and read every book in the library. J.K. Rowling would lock herself in her bedroom and read books to get away from her fighting parents. In college, she had library fines because she had so many books taken out. And so one of the things you see is that actually consumption is hugely important to the creative process. And the reason why is it turns out that when we talk about creativity, we often talk about these aha moments, these flashes of genius that we experience. Well, these flashes of genius are actually a pretty normal biological process. They're just how our right brain does its work. Our right brain connects more divergent ideas together, and the actual processing it does is pretty subconscious. It's not like our left brain, which you're very conscious as you're solving problems with your left brain, like a math problem. Like, it's very step by step. Your right brain does it all subconsciously, and only once it gets an answer does it pop into consciousness. But for your right brain to do that, it needs to have things to work on. You need to have prior knowledge. You need to have the dots if you want to connect the dots. You need to have electricity if you want to have light bulb moments. And so you find that consumption is actually hugely important to creativity because it gives these people the fuel for their creative thoughts, for them to actually use, to connect, to remix, to think about. And so consumption is one of the things that surprised me so much because I think it's so antithetical to our notions around creators.
One of the topics you talk about, imitation, was one that, while I could see it, it kind of surprised me as well. I'm like, oh, okay, because you do see where people take something and make it better, or, take something and kind of, branch off in another direction with a product. So it was really interesting to see how that correlates as well.
Yeah, so one of the things when we talk about creativity is we often talk about how much of it is focused on novelty and newness. We use the word innovation almost synonymous with creativity. But the issue is that creativity is actually not just about newness. Creativity is about creating things that are both new and valuable. you actually wouldn't like things that are radically new. If someone made a movie that was 30 hours long and didn't have a protagonist, you'd probably be like, oh, this is kind of weird. I don't really like this. And so it turns out that when scientists actually look at consumer preference and consumer taste, the thing that drives us is that we both are attracted to things that are familiar, but we also pursue the novel. We like things that are familiar because they feel safe, they're not going to hurt us. We like things that are novel because they represent potential reward. And so these two things are a seeming contradiction, our pursuit of both the familiar and the novel. But the result is that for creatives, the best creatives, they understand that the best ideas have one foot in the familiar and one foot in the novel. And imitation is a way that they do this. And it's not plagiarism. It's not, saying, oh, we're going to take the content that someone else did. But no, it's about imitating the structure of great successful works. I mean, the first Star Wars was a Western in space, right? You see this over and over again. I think about right now there's that trend in America of the sushi burrito that's blowing up. It's sushi, but it's a burrito. It's familiar, but it's novel. And the way to do this in a scalable way is through imitation. So what you see, for example, is, Kurt Vonnegut, the author, when he was first getting started, he tried to get a master's degree in anthropology, and his thesis, he actually was all about mapping out the story arcs of great successful works. That was actually what he did. You see this with Ben Franklin when he talks about learning to become a great writer. What he did was he actually went and outlined the arguments of some of these great creative writers that he looked up to, and that's how he actually learned how to tell a great story. And so that's really where I think you really get your handle on how to create the familiar if you're creative. It's through imitation.
Well, I'm not quite sold on the sushi burritos as being a thing I would enjoy, but, each to their own. But it does spark curiosity, and you're 100% right about that. On this note, we are going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Alan Gannett on his new book, The Creative Curve. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here talking with Alan Gannett on his new book, The Creative Curve. So, Alan, I know in your book you talk about how community is so important. Why is it so important for creatives to have a community?
So, we think of creators as these solo geniuses, right? The idea of like a creator going into a cabin and, writing their great American novel. And of course, these days it's all based in Williamsburg and it's all a coming of age story. And they only come out once they write the words at the end. But the reality is that creativity is actually a very social phenomenon. And part of the reason why is that since creativity is actually about, creating stuff that people actually want, when I talk about creativity, I'm talking about uppercase C creativity, which is creating things that are both new and valuable, not lowercase c creativity, which is just creating something new. But value is a social construct, right? What we deem valuable, is only when lots of people say it's valuable, or even a small group of people say it's valuable. And so the result is that you actually have to engage a lot of other people in creativity because, you need people to experience your creativity. They need to see it. They need to learn about it. They need to talk about it. Recognition is hugely important for creativity. So, for example, you see that the best creators often are associated with what I call prominent promoters, where they have people who already have reputation, who already have credibility, who sort of lend them their credibility, lend them their reputation, who tell them, you see this with musicians, with opening acts, right? Rascal Flatts had Taylor Swift open for them. She became famous, and she had Shawn Mendes open for her. Now he's famous. Now he has people open for him. And you see this sort of passing on of reputation. Academics, you see the same thing. Senior researchers let junior researchers put their names on the paper because it helps them build their portfolio and build their resume. There was this famous study done where they compared the careers of Nobel laureates to scientists of similar pedigrees who did not become Nobel laureates. And one of the things they found was that their names appeared on papers in their 20s about twice that of people who did not become Nobel laureates. And you might think, of course, they were more productive. That's why they become Nobel laureates. But actually, it wasn't they were more productive. They did the same amount of work. It's just the ones who went on to become Nobel laureates, their mentors gave them recognition more often. So by the time they were in their 30s, they were on double the amount of papers, double the amount of citations. They had this compounding advantage that they couldn't be beat on. And so you actually find that reputation, sort of social recognition, is hugely important to creative achievement.
Yeah, that's such a big thing. I mean, because it really, a lot of times almost feels like it all depends on who you know.
Oh, totally. And I think this is one of the reasons why in creative fields, the reality is even today, you have to move to the city where your creative field is dominant, or you have to go there a lot, right? If you want to be a fine artist, you better live in New York. If you want to be in entertainment, you better be in LA or New York or maybe Chicago if you're in comedy. But there is something to actually seeing someone face to face that you can't do over the phone, you can't do over Skype, that drives so much of a relationship. And since relationships are so important to creativity, I actually think moving is one of the essential things you have to do.
Well, I would agree with you on that, person-to-person, kind of in-person meetings, how important that is, how important it is for people to see you, because then they get to actually have a sense of who it is that you are and then kind of decide whether or not they like you. Once they like you, it's kind of a done deal.
And then you actually have this like long-term relationship, and you have a friendship. That's always good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, friendships are always good. I'm all for that. So, okay. So since we're kind of toggling over to friendship, when I think of friendship, I was looking at you have a list of people that you interviewed. And I'm surprised this wasn't like one of the first ones you started talking about. But I understood you were hanging out in a place called Chubby Hubby. And
oh, my God.
To share with us what that experience was like.
So what you're referring to is I spent a day at the Ben & Jerry's headquarters where there is a conference room named Chubby Hubby after the flavor. And I spent a day with the flavor team there, which is in charge of making the 8 to 12 new flavors that Ben & Jerry's comes up with every year. And what was amazing is that, first of all, by the way, as someone who's not very tolerant of milk, this was a very interesting experience. But what was amazing is that, you think of creativity and you think of creators and you think of these sort of mad scientists, and Ben & Jerry's is just sort of all of those things. And, their innovation process, they have these amazingly talented food scientists and chefs, but their innovation process is shockingly structured. It's shockingly data-driven. One of the things that they do is that every year they spend all of this time literally consuming information about food trends. Like they go to restaurants and eat, they go to new bars, they will travel on these trips called trend treks where they go and try different cities to see, what is the interesting food ideas that are percolating in that city. And they do all of this research for a year. And every year their innovation process starts where they come up with a list of 200 ideas of flavors that they think may work. And the first thing they do is they don't start making ice cream. They actually start by sending out an email survey. They send out a survey to their customers, and they ask customers 2 questions about each flavor idea. 1, how likely are you to buy it? And 2, how unique is it? Which is basically how familiar is it and how novel is it? Because if they just ask, well, how likely are you to buy it? Well, we'd end up with all these overly familiar flavors. The entire line of Ben & Jerry's would be salted caramel brownie cookie crunch. So the reason why Ben & Jerry's has done such a good job at staying relevant is that they've been able to balance familiarity and novelty in their innovation process in a structured way. Because from that survey, that's how they actually winnow down their list to 15 ideas that they actually create samples of. So the first step in this culinary process isn't actually creating something, it's actually listening. And I think that's one of the things you see among these great creators is that listening is hugely important to their process.
Well, you can easily see that they're doing pretty well because even though if it was just like caramel crunch, whatever, people love that. But they do come out with some pretty amazing things, and I would guess that most of them are pretty successful based off on the research that they're doing.
Yeah, what's interesting is that even with all that research, they still have failures, but what they do is they keep listening to their audience. So their failures are relatively short. They actually have a call center team, and they call it it's part of the consumer insights team, and one of the roles of the call center team is to listen, like when a new flavor comes out, do people actually like it? Or did something go wrong that we couldn't have foreseen the research? So, for example, if you've ever had at the movies, if you ever mixed M&Ms and popcorn, it's amazing. And so, of course, they tried to make a flavor around this, and they did great in the testing. It tasted great in the lab. But it turns out that when you put popcorn in ice cream and you freeze it and, it's shipped to the store, it's on the shelf, well, the moisture that seeps in to the popcorn makes the popcorn kind of soggy. And turns out it's kind of gross. And so they very quickly got that feedback through the phone, and they were able to realize, okay, this was a mistake. They stopped it, and they learned from that. They learned more about the effects that moisture has on the things they put into the ice cream. And that's one of the ways they realized that we should really focus on things like cookies, where we put cookies in, and they're hard when we put them in. But after they're frozen, actually the cookies become soft and doughy, which is wonderful. And so by listening to your audience, you're constantly learning and refining your creative process. And I think most creators who are aspiring sort of view creativity as something they're doing for themselves, but the best creators view it as something they're doing specifically for the audience.
Okay, so now wait a minute. So this popcorn and M&Ms kind of deal, did they get that from you? Because didn't you have a game you were developing that had that?
Oh my God. I did have as a only child, I did have one of the ways I amused myself. Oh my God, where'd you find this? Is I did have this game where I would play toy soldiers, and the one army was popcorn and one was M&Ms, and when they died, I would eat one, and so this is why I was a fat kid until I was 10.
Well, I think we all go through that kind of that stage.
Yeah, it happens.
But I'm pretty sure they took the popcorn and M&Ms idea from you. I mean, I'm sure about that now.
We'll take it. I'll get a licensing fee.
They just have to redevelop it. Well, and it's so interesting. So when companies do this, when they have these things that could be like these creative, genius moments, and then they have to pivot and go, gosh, okay, from a consumer standpoint, that really didn't work out like we thought. It's like with Ben & Jerry's again. It's great how they look at that and then they listen to what their audience is saying and then pull that information and then maybe even pull your beloved ice cream,
Oh, totally. And the Ben & Jerry's, I think, example is just so wonderful at this. I mean, they actually have Chubby Hubby, for example, the flavor, which has become super popular. was actually the result of some customers as a prank took Ben & Jerry's, put a bunch of pretzels in it, gave it to a friend, and said it's the new Ben & Jerry's flavor as a joke. And the person was like, this is amazing. And so they wrote to Ben & Jerry's about this, and they turned it into a flavor. And so you see that these great creators are just obsessed with listening to their audience.
Well, and so why don't you share with us, because we've talked about just like obviously you were at Ben & Jerry's. Well, what about one of the other places that either you went to or you know, one of the individuals you interviewed for the book? Why don't you share with us another story?
Well, one of the people I interviewed who I thought was really fascinating was David Rubenstein. He's a billionaire. He's the co-founder of the Carlyle Group, sort of one of the godfathers of the private equity industry, which I do think of as creative because they're constantly trying to find new deals, new innovations, new things that are novel and valuable. And you know, he's also a huge philanthropist. So you know, he was the guy when there was an earthquake and the Washington Monument cracked. He's the guy who ponied up to fix it. He put his own $25 million in to fix it. He's on the board of Smithsonian, the Kennedy Center. I think he's the chairman of both right now. Like he's just, I mean, the guy's just incredible. The top of his career. He's late 60s. And when I went to interview him, well, first of all, I just cold emailed him. Like, I just sent him an email, and he's incredibly nice, incredibly responsive. He said, "Sure, let's come get tea." And so we went and got tea, and you know, he's a recognizable character. People know who he is. And, you know, people will come up and say hi. And I was shocked by how nice he was, but also how curious he was. You know, this is one of the things I found is that these great creatives who have these long careers, they actually were very, very focused on learning from everyone. Not just people who are maybe at their level, but, you know, a lot of times young people, right? He started asking me a bunch of questions, right? They're constantly trying to vacuum up all this knowledge because it's part of how they stay fresh and relevant. They realize that they just can't keep doing the old familiar ways. It's about, again, that blend of the familiar and the novel. And so that was one of those things that was really sort of eye-opening for me, was seeing this billionaire asking other people questions, asking me questions, being incredibly courteous and nice. And there's a guy who, you know, has enough money that he doesn't have to be any of those things. But he realizes that curiosity is such a huge part of what's driven him to success, and he loves it, and he wants to keep doing it.
It's always so nice when you meet people that, you know, that go out of their way to be kind and nice, because, you know, a lot of times we see such bad examples of people who maybe do have exceeding means and aren't really holding up that kind of a standard.
Totally. And I mean, the reality is that, you know, we have to, if we want to, you know, build our careers, we have to be very long-term oriented. That's both in a long-term orientation towards learning and curiosity, but also a long-term orientation how to treat people. Like, I didn't really mention this in the book, but one thing I thought was so interesting was, you know, these people who are really successful also are like, most of them are very nice. They're pleasant, they're charming, they're affable, they remember things, they're accessible. And, you know, I don't think that was a selection bias issue, just because of how I went about finding people, you know. And so you see that these people who are at the top of their craft, they typically took a very long-term approach to how they interacted with the world. They weren't jerks. I think you're seeing right now in you know, even at the Me Too movement, you're seeing that a lot of people, when they're jerks, it eventually comes home to roost. It eventually comes home to roost. And so I think you can be belligerent. I think you can be a bad person. And I think you can achieve in our society, unfortunately, some level of power and influence. But I think eventually it comes back to haunt you. I do think we have, overall these days, sort of a long arc towards justice and careers. And so I think if you want to be a top achiever, it's very important to treat people with dignity and respect.
I would agree with you on that. And that kind of just goes back into what you discussed in your book about community. You know, obviously these people who are highly successful and highly creative, one of the things that they've been able to figure out is that a lot of times they can't do it on their own. They need to have a community of people that are backing them and working with them. And a lot of times the way to do that is by, you know, being able to communicate with people in such a way that that makes them want to be part of something bigger.
Totally. And the community aspect is also interesting because you see this with a lot of these people, we think of these, I call it the frontman effect, where we have one name on the book cover. We think about J.K. Rowling. We think about, even with my book, it's like my name's on the book cover. But when you write a book, you have all these people involved. You have an agent, a publisher, an editor, a copy editor, a proofreader, research assistants, feedback readers, all these people. And so creativity inherently takes a village. And if you're not very good at meeting people in the village, you're going to struggle.
Yeah, because it's all about, also how you get along with other people. And so it kind of makes me think, you interviewed so many fascinating and wonderful people for this book. Were there interviews that, because I can just imagine that this book was probably, because with all books, a lot of times we make them a little bit bigger, and then, through the editing process, there are some things that have to be taken out. Were there any interviews that you did that didn't quite make it to the book, just out of pure space?
Oh, yeah, totally. Some of the ones that I thought were, particularly interesting that didn't end up making it were, I interviewed this famous producer, Michael Schamberg, who has had his hands in just lots and lots of sort of successful movies and didn't end up making the book. But one of the things he sort of pointed me to early on in my process was to look at people's childhoods and be sure to ask them about their childhoods. And I started doing this, and one, it's just a really great interviewing thing because you find that there's often really rich stories there. But specifically when you're talking about creativity, so much of this starts in people's childhood, because a lot of times what happens is that, these people who are successful in their 20s and 30s, they had to start when they were young to be successful by then. And so you often find that a lot of times what we think of as natural-born talent was really someone had, a helicopter parent who pushed them very hard. They maybe were in a situation where it wasn't a particularly good situation, so creativity became a sort of escape mechanism for them, or they had one person in their life who was a very positive influence and drove them towards that. And so to me, that is just one of those things that was one a really powerful moment, because it made me realize that I think we often don't spend enough time when we talk about the lives of very successful people, really investigating or interrogating, I don't mean that in a dark way, their childhoods, right? What drove this person to took these amounts of efforts to become who they are today? Because what I'm not saying in the book is that it's easy. I am saying there's a path, but I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, I think it's incredibly hard. I don't even know if most people would actually want to do what it takes. But the thing is that the reason why these people who achieve it do is often there's something pushing them to go through these steps. There's something external. There's some force. There's some constraint. And I think that was a really interesting insight for me as I was going through the process. So that was definitely probably the one that sticks out.
One of the things that, there's a lot in your book that I just found to be very useful information, and most of it was like, wow, I had no idea about this. You go about life and you just do your thing, and it takes someone as creative and brilliant as you to go and pull all this information together so people have an understanding of what creativity means and how to develop it. But one of the things you talk about was in regards to being like an insider or an outsider on a team, and how that helps with not just the team itself, but how they can also develop better ideas.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting. Again, to this idea of the familiar in the novel, what they found was that the best teams are comprised of people who are sort of in the middle between the establishment and the fringe, the fresh ideas. But it's really hard to be that, right? It's actually quite difficult to be someone who's perfectly in the middle. So it turns out that the one other way you can get the same effect is to have teams that are comprised of people from both the establishment and the fringe. So they did this one study, these NYU professors, where they looked at movie crews, and they found the movies that won the most awards were comprised of people where the key people, producers, directors, screenwriters, were a mix of establishment figures and fringe figures, because this gave them the familiarity, it gave them the reputation, it gave them the credibility of the establishment, but it gave them the novelty, that newness that's required from the fringe. And so that, I think, is actually something that's really important, and something that I think a lot of people, when they're building their teams, mess up, is that they look for a lot of people who have experience, who maybe are similar to them, who have a reputation who precedes them. But you also need people who are different. You need people who aren't similar, people who come from the fringe and have those new ideas. And so I think that, you talk about a lot of these days in culture about diversity, and I think cognitive diversity is super important, and I think represents all sorts of different ways that people come to it. But I think that's a really, really important thing when you're building a team. There's actually a book that just came out from my friend Shane Snow called Dream Teams. It's all about cognitive diversity that is definitely worth checking out, because I think that's one of the things we struggle with when we're building a creative team, is that we look for these people who have been such big successes. But if you just do that, you'll end up just following the same old idea, and eventually it'll be stale.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We've had Shane on the show and love his book.
Love Shane. I didn't know that. He's great.
Yeah, he's fabulous. And, it makes me kind of think, my goodness, you must put a lot of these same principles into practice with TrackMaven, with your company, bringing in some new talent, and, to kind of mix with people that maybe have a little bit more of an established resume.
Yeah, it's one of those things you see. I think a startup is a great example of this, where, you have, and I even have this, how I run my company is it's me, and then I have a president, and, Tim is, I won't say exactly because he'll get mad at me, but he's, roughly double my age and very different sort of life experiences. And, but together we're very different, but also very close, and we trust each other. And together we find that we're actually much more effective. And I made him president maybe 2 or 3 years ago because I sort of realized that there were things that I didn't know how to do. And rather than sort of constantly trying to learn how to do these things that I didn't know how to do, I found that actually bringing another person into the equation who's actually very different than me actually made me better and it made the company better. And so I think you find that a lot of times the best collaboration is not with people who are similar to you, but actually people who are different than you.
I'm all for that because, my goodness, they show up with, better ideas, better ways to do things. If you try to do everything yourself, it's kind of a, jack of all trades and master of none.
Exactly. Specialization is actually really important when it comes to doing anything creative, whether it's art or startups or, anything.
Well, I think we have enough time for one more thing. I know you talk about scrambled eggs and Paul McCartney, and I'd love for you to share that story with us, because you hear this and you're like, how does that even have a connection? That makes no sense whatsoever.
So Paul McCartney has the #1 record for #1 singles, and he also wrote the #1 most recorded song of all time, Yesterday. And Yesterday has this creation story that is I think, just such a great sort of prototypical example of how we sort of perceive creativity, which is that we say that the story is that he woke up with the song from Yesterday in his head. And he literally had it in a dream. He dreamed up the most recorded song in history. And, of course, like most things when it comes to creativity and creativity mythology, it's myth. It's made up. The real story is that he dreamed up 6 notes that were really sort of a reinterpretation of Ray Charles's version of Georgia on My Mind, which he loved Ray Charles. And so he had these 6 notes. And he was, in fact, so worried when he had these 6 notes that maybe he had accidentally plagiarized something directly that he went around to his friends for weeks and sort of anxiously asked them, "Hey, have you heard this before? Because I'm a little worried." And they were like, "No, we haven't, Paul." And he's like, "Are you sure?" And he actually he only dreamed up 6 notes, not the entire song, not even the lyrics. And so as placeholder lyrics, he one day when he was playing the song for someone, the story goes that this person's mother came in and offered scrambled eggs, and so he ended up using scrambled eggs as the lyrics. And so the placeholder lyrics were scrambled eggs, oh my baby, how I love your eggs, I believe in scrambled eggs. So hopefully that was the only time someone's ever sung terribly on your radio show. But
no, you did great.
Oh, great. And so what you find is that the scrambled egg story is a really interesting example where, Paul McCartney actually took 20 months to finish the song Yesterday. It was nothing close to this idea of this, instantaneous moment of genius. No, it was 6 notes and then these weird lyrics and then 20 months of work. And so, creativity is not this thing that most of us just have in a sudden strike. It's a thing that we work at. And scrambled eggs are another example of that.
Well, now that you've sung that, I'll remember it forever. I would remember it. It made all the difference, But it's so important to have these stories because it gives people something to kind of use as a reference point. Because when we think about Paul McCartney waking up and having a song in his head, most people think, oh, well, he was just done. I'm done. But, he took such care and kind of even, was driven by it for a little while.
Yeah, his friends actually got annoyed at him. The rest of the Beatles, his managers, his stage managers, all these people started getting really frustrated because he wouldn't stop working on the song. Like he would when they were going on tour, he would find a piano and just keep working at it. And at one point they told him just finish it up, stop it, please. And he didn't. And that's what you find is that these stories. J.K. Rowling, the stories that she was hit with the idea for Harry Potter on a train, and the reality is she had the idea for Harry and a couple of the characters, and she spent 5 years getting the first book out. 5 years. And there's an interview she did once with a TV interviewer, and she shows the interviewer the box of the 15 different versions that she had written of chapter 1 of book 1. 15 different versions. And so I think we like to sort of grasp on to these stories, but they're not reality, and I think they do us a disservice by making it seem like, well, for some people it's easy, and, I should just wait until something's easy for me, or otherwise just assume I'm never going to get there, because that's not true.
Yeah, and kind of waiting for divine intervention to come down with a unicorn and a great idea when, again, we don't have unicorns in our backyard. You might, I know.
Mine keeps leaving. I can't get to stay in the yard. I got an electric fence. It'll be a whole thing.
Yeah, it makes all the difference. They'll probably come up with a Ben & Jerry's unicorn next. Oh, well, Alan, my goodness, it's such a joy to spend this time with you. You really know this inside out. Where can people connect with you and be part of your community?
So the book's website is thecreativecurve.com. And if you also, when you're there, you can see a very silly book trailer that involves my adorable 4-year-old corgi. And then my website is allen.xyz.
Well, I'm sure your corgi probably has his own social media now.
Of course he does.
I saw a picture and I'm like, that's one cute dog.
It's critical. Internet age. Corgis, dogs,
Yeah, hey, he's got to have his own voice. But, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today, Alan.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's been such a joy to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your book, The Creative Curve. Now, Alan's book is available at all major retailers, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. And if you're traveling, just like I was recently, you can also pick it up at Hudson Books. You can't miss it. It's one of their highly displayed books right up on their shelves. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.